to have the chance to welcome in person Andrew Solomon to the Child Study Center. Andrew, I know you've been a friend of the center's for a while, but it's really, really very generous of you to be with us. Andrew is a graduate of Yale, very long-term friend of Yale, and has also been a very steadfast supporter of children and children's mental health and the needs of children's mental health. Many, many books. The most impressive article of recent, they're all impressive, but the most is your piece in the New Yorker on social media and suicide, making you would have been a timely speaker in any case, but making you an extraordinary so for us. And so we're so grateful for you to take the time to be with us and to give us your wisdom and help us bring this home.
Thank you. I think I'm good. Thank you all. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to be back at Yale always. We were just discussing the fact that if you're working on the issue of youth suicide, you are constantly asked why you are working on the issue of youth suicide. I won't go through the whole story, which was in a previous article, but I am writing a book about it. I did just do this article for the New Yorker, but my 15-year-old son, the other day, we had finished our main course, and he said he was going to go upstairs and do some homework. And I said, George, don't you want some dessert? And he said, I think I'll leave before the youth suicide conversation kicks in again. And this morning when I was leaving, he said, I'm going up to Yale, I'm giving a talk. He said, youth suicide. I said, yeah, well, social media and youth suicide. He said, at least you have a nice suit. So that's where I'll begin. And I also just want to express my admiration for the speakers we've heard, but also for the work of the Child Study Center, which is so remarkable and so unparalleled. I think there is far too little, there's a great deal of populist media attention to children's mental health, but very little attention, I think, to the real underlying issues. And I'll begin, I think, in terms of giving some indication of what it means to look at these questions by saying that the whole issue of these different kinds of communication in some tiny way was summed up by the fact that when Linda first mentioned my coming, there was a question of my speaking by Zoom. And I said, no, I'll come and do it in person, which is not only because it's so pleasant driving back and forth, but also because I really do think that communication over electronics is very profoundly different from communication in person. Even in a context like this, where rather formally I'm sitting up here and you're all sitting there, it's still got an immensely different feeling from somebody sort of flickering on and off on a screen. And I keep thinking back to an experiment that was done in 2003, which now seems like ancient history, but in the relatively early days of everything being online, in which a group of children in a working class area in California who would have had no exposure to any kind of Asian culture in that particular community, they took half of them and they had someone who came and played with them, I think it was twice a week, and spoke to them in Mandarin when they were still really in infancy. And children go through a process of losing phoneme recognition. As infants, they can recognize a great many phonemes, and it narrows as they get older and as they develop. So she came and played with them and spoke to them in Mandarin. And then the other half of the group, the same woman appeared on a video screen saying pretty much exactly the same things to them and effectively trying to play with them through the screen. And little children are fascinated by screens, as is obvious from the topic of today's conference. And so they all were looking up at this screen the whole time and were fascinated. And when they tested them after, I think it was 8 months, the children who had played with her had not lost any of the phonemes that were associated with Mandarin. And the children who had been looking at her on a screen had lost all of those phonemes and had no ability to recognize or distinguish any of them. And so I thought already then, 21 years ago, I thought this is a very different matter. And I think that there's often a tendency to lose sight of that and to lose sight of the ways in which communicating through a screen is fundamentally different. It has advantages, it has disadvantages, but the suggestion that it's all of a muchness is a very confusing proposition. And there's been a lot of talk lately about the idea that the use of phones and the use of screens and the use of social media is resulting in a great rewiring of the adolescent brain. That phrase has been thrown around an enormous amount and has had some headlines attached to it. Everything we do is connected to a great rewiring. And if adolescent brains weren't subject to a lot of great rewiring, then education would have to come to an end. It's based on the idea of great rewiring. And so we're constantly going through various kinds of rewiring. There's also a great deal of talk, and indeed it was a phrase I heard you several times today, about the mental health crisis. Now, there is no question that there are problems in mental health, and there are significant problems in adolescent mental health. But if you look at the overall graphs and overall statistics, mental health appears to have been declining since it was first measured at a population level about a century ago. There are various measures. It's had its sort of moments when it came more up and more down, but that's been the overall tendency. And there's also a lot of talk about the question of whether children who give up social media or are deprived of social media in one way or another actually do better and are psychologically more healthy. And it appears that social media, as a number of people said today, is a factor. And the problem is that in this very polarized moment in our country, that this debate too has become polarized, so that by and large, outside of this room, people either are saying all the problems of the world are because of social media, or saying social media is actually fine. And the reality is that social media is contributing to and is often the vehicle for information that leads to problems in mental health. But everybody, I think, as a general rule, likes to find simple answers to complex problems. That's been very attractive even in this electoral campaign, unfortunately. And so there has been repeatedly this notion that really, if we just dealt with social media, everyone would be fine. And it would be lovely if that were the case, because social media is more straightforward to deal with than other things. But when people say, people sometimes feel better if they don't have social media, I often want to say they might also feel better if you sort of made climate change go away for a while, or if we got rid of opioids, or if racial inequality were to disappear from this country, or if they were all actually persuaded that they were likely to live at least as well as, if not better than, their parents did, and so on and so forth. All of those are much harder experiments to run, but they remain very significant ones. The other thing is that the adolescent mental health crisis, as it is often called, has been shown to be correlated with the rise of smartphones, social media, reverse cameras, selfies, all kinds of other things, comparative functions, all of which play a role. But it is also the case that every generation is different in many ways from previous generations, and that history, whether it repeats itself or not, is also different. And so this has also been the period in which, and I hope anyone whose political point of view is different from mine will forgive me, but it's the period in which Trumpism has come to be a dominant part of American life, and civility has in large part disappeared from public discourse. It's also the period in which lots of things happen that are very difficult to tie to social media. Autism has risen. The average male sperm count has gone down. We are dealing with far more microplastics in the food chain than we used to. I can go on and on. It's not that I, in any paranoid way, want to say that one of these things is actually the real answer, only to say that when there are so many things, the idea that there is a real answer relies on a kind of Newtonian model in which there are all these parts to a machine, and you could take one of them out and fix it, and then and then everything functions again. And I think we've all learned that the brain and psychology altogether don't work in that way, and that whatever happens is often the result of many, many, many factors that are coming together. Now, I don't mean that to suggest that I think there are not problems with social media, that it doesn't need to be regulated. As I'll demonstrate, I feel quite the opposite, only that I think those reductive models are very dangerous because they distract us from the complexity of the problems that we are facing and that our children are facing. And I see those as I talk to my children. I see them as I talk to, I just spoke with a godchild who said to me, the leader of the free world hates me and everyone like me, which is to say all of my friends. How do you think that makes me feel? And so I think to say that that's a social media problem is very difficult. And I could list for the next half hour what I think some of the other issues are. I also think that the lawsuits which are being brought against social media companies, though they are often, I think, very helpful, and ultimately as activism may serve to bring about regulation which is useful and appropriate, they're also naive again in the finger pointing. When I have talked to, as I now have in researching my book, many, many, many young people who have survived suicide attempts, and I say, what was it that got you to that point? Social media does not come up nearly as often as other things do. And I thought, well, if we're going to start suing social media companies, should we also sue ExxonMobil for the ways in which it tried to disguise its contributions, both in the past and ongoing, and now I'm afraid likely to be in the future, to climate change? What is the point at which we say who is responsible and who is not responsible, and what is available and what is not available? Do we go back to, I don't know, looking at the whole structure of capitalism in a modern society? So I think we begin by saying that social media helps some people enormously, and that it harms other people enormously, and that it has a moderate effect on lots and lots and lots of other people. Children do die because of social media. I've now spent a lot of time with families where it seems to have been the decisive factor. Most harms are not harmful to everyone. There are plenty of people. I have a good friend who is a constant heavy smoker and who is 97 and seems to be in absolutely fantastic shape. It's not as though everyone who picks up a cigarette is going to die of cancer, but we've had a big movement against tobacco and against cigarette companies because the risk is sufficiently substantial to warrant that. And so one of the things that is striking about social media is that it is protected under US law in a way that other consumer products are not. It is protected by Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, which says, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider, which effectively means that, if you run the Bon Appetit website and someone writes something terribly mean-spirited on there about a recipe that didn't work, that Bon Appetit is not responsible for that nasty remark and cannot be sued. But it has been taken to mean that actually social media companies don't have any responsibility for the harm that they cause. And it's come up over and over again. No court in the United States has been willing to call it into question. The issue came before the Supreme Court last year of Section 230, and they very decisively decided that they were not going to make any change, that would be left to Congress, or Congress wished to do so, but they accept the Section 230 protection. And really, in order to describe those, I would say, if you're looking at the question of libel, you can sue an author for libel. You can sue a publisher for libel. you cannot sue a bookstore for libel. In 1996, when the Communications Decency Act was written and most of what was being posted was on CompuServe and other things that most of us either don't or barely remember, it was pretty clear that the platforms were just bookstores. But it's pretty clear now that they're frequently publishers, and that the algorithms in particular push particular content toward people in ways that can be unbelievably dangerous. And so continuing to treat them effectively as bookstores is not only not honest about what is really at stake, it is also, in the end, a sort of willful insistence on things not changing. And I think the idea that the internet has not changed since 1996 is sort of like saying, that current copyright law was really written to apply to Shakespeare's early comedies. And there has been a lot of anger about this lack of liability, and for good reason. As one of the people I worked with, Gretchen Peters, said, one door flew off a Boeing plane and no one really questioned whether the entire fleet should be grounded. And yet we see children who keep dying because of what is on social media, and people vaguely protest, and there are some symposiums like this one. I'll get through to the government piece of it later. The will for change tends to be limited and very much curtailed in part by the enormous financial and lobbying power of these organizations. I'm going to read to you just a few social media exchanges to give you a feeling for the kinds of things that are going on for anyone who hasn't had to deal with them. A young woman who was not an actress, who was 10, named Selena Gomez, in April of 2020, received this series of messages rapid fire when she tried to discontinue her interaction with a stranger. A man claiming that he was writing from India, which I think ultimately turned out not to be the case, wrote, "Can you send me your boobs pic? Please, can you send? Show your boobs. Please, show your pussy. Please, dear, send pic. I will send you my penis pic. Please send your pussy pic, or you send it." Goes on and on and on in that vein. She, before she killed herself, wrote something the following year in which she said, "I am crying. I want to die. I feel like everyone hates me. I fight myself every day not to care so much because I remember some people love me. I self-harm. I know I sound dramatic and dumb, but my depression is so bad and I'm just not okay inside." She, in the meanwhile, had been invited by this man to a party she had gone to and had been sexually abused not only by him, but also by his friends. These are the things that are happening on those platforms all the time. And as Josh Kozlov, one of the lawyers who worked on the Sandy Hook case, said, Meta is a matchmaking purveyor of a dangerous item and a user with an underdeveloped brain. It's like a middle-aged man dating a 12-year-old girl, which I think is often the case. Now, new forms of media, whatever they may be, have consistently posed challenges to us. In the 19th century, there was a lot of worry about women who, in particular women, but whose brains would turn to mush because they were reading novels, which were considered very dangerous, the same novels that I, as an undergraduate, was required to study, sort of not very far from here. There was a suggestion that bicycles were actually going to be addictive. There was the whole question of prohibition, which actually very much lowered the death rate, but people then felt that the cost of doing so was too enormous. There are books on radio addiction. There were all of the things about reefer madness and the ongoing questions of the harms of marijuana, comic books, which were supposed to engender illiteracy. They're now called graphic novels, and they're the essence of literacy. As a baby boomer, I was told that I could not watch the TV for more than an hour a day because it was the idiot box. And so this goes on and on and on. Tipper Gore had a big campaign against rap lyrics because she thought they would engender violence and so on. And one of my classmates here, Ann Applebaum, said recently that she thought every time there had been major progress in communications technologies, the result had been an undermining of social order. So she said, really, if you look at the invention of the printing press, it was one of the primary contributors to the religious wars. Now, of course, we think of printed books as being the essence of civilization, but it took a while to figure out what it was, what our relationship to them was. And broadcast media, radio and later television, were tools in the rise of both fascism and communism in the middle of the 20th century. So on the one hand, social media is different. And on the other hand, the issues connected to it can be quite similar. And I chose one passage, part of which I had quoted in the New Yorker, because I dimly remembered it from a high school play, but that seemed to me to sound like it was about social media, except that it's from 1976. And it's a speech in a Sam Shepard play in which a Los Angeles secretary says, I look at the screen and I am the screen. I'm not me. I don't know who I am. I look at the movie and I am the movie. I am the star. I am the star in the movie. For days, I am the star, and I'm not me. I'm me being the star. I look at my life when I come down. I look and I hate my life when I come down. I hate being myself in my life, which isn't a movie and never will be. I hate having to eat, having to work, having to sleep, having to go to the bathroom, having to get from one place to another with no potential, having to live in this body, which isn't a star's body, and all the time knowing that stars exist. I think any of you can imagine influencer instead of star and finding that paragraph published today. Suicide is very basic to the human condition. The earliest text of which I'm aware was an Egyptian text that was discovered relatively recently, that's from, I think, the 8th century BC, which is a dialogue between a man and his soul, in which the man is trying to convince his soul that he has good reason to kill himself. In the tradition that he was in, if you kill yourself, your soul abandons you, and he persuades his soul to stay with him on grounds that what he is doing makes sense. And so the idea of having institutions like the Zero Suicide Foundation, while the name sounds terrific, I think they're often foolish ideas. In fact, overall, the rate of suicide right now is lower than it was 100 years ago. It's currently about 14 people per 100,000. In the 1930s, it was 22 people per 100,000. Youth suicide, on the other hand, has been going up, but it nearly tripled between 1950 and 1980. And nobody at the time said, why is it going up in this way, or at least not to the same degree? And then it began going down. And nobody said, what brilliant thing have we done in the 1990s that is causing the suicide rate to go down? So this tendency to sensationalize it, which is so dominant right now, is quite dangerous. And as Dylan Selterman, who's at Johns Hopkins, said, we aren't a mentally healthy society, and we haven't been for a very long time. I would add, really, if ever. Lawrence Steinberg, who's at Temple University, has said that there are really 3 possible scenarios in looking at this question of social media. One is that social media causes mental illness. That's sort of the popular one right now. One is that mentally fragile people overuse social media, and so it's actually the reverse. And the third is that people who are just dealing with other stresses become depressed, and then sort of separately, when they're depressed, aren't going out as much, so they spend some time on social media, which has no causal effect and is not really essential to it at all. And he said, all of these interpretations are reasonable, given the widespread eagerness to condemn social media it's important to remember that it may benefit more adolescents than it hurts. Our tendency is to search for the simplest explanation. If other factors have contributed to the rise in adolescent depression and are being overlooked in the rush to point the finger at Facebook, we may be contributing to the very problem we hope to solve. And Gina Neff, who runs the technology research domain at Cambridge, said, just because social media is the easiest target doesn't make it the right target. So I think it's a matter of tolerating nuance and complexity in looking at this problem, which, as I've said, are not very common things. And then also, back to what I said about cigarettes, trying to draw the difference between saying, Instagram killed this child, which I think in some instances can in fact be defended, and saying Instagram has caused the mental health crisis we're dealing with in the world now, which is a very different proposition. And I think if you're looking child by child, a lot of what's being said makes a lot of sense. I think if we're trying to look at the society altogether, it's much, much harder to defend that. Nonetheless, suicide for people aged 10 to 19 went up by nearly half between 2010 and 2020. The CDC has found that 1 in 3 teenage girls considered taking her life last year, up from 1 in 5 just 2 years ago. Some of these statistics are other versions of them because they're very hard to pin down. That were volunteered earlier in this meeting. I was very much struck, in part because it is my own community, but in part just because it seemed like such a shocking statistic. The CDC, which is not an activist organization, showed that last year, 26.3% of LGBTQ high school students made a viable suicide attempt. That's a quarter of them. And I remember thinking, oh, we'll win marriage and we'll have, I don't know, Pete Buttigieg, will be the transportation secretary and will fill everyone with hope. And all of the AIDS crisis will be brought under control and this level of misery will abate. And it's changed shape a little bit and it exists differently in different places. And we're on social media and I'm not going to go off on it. But I think we often think, oh, we just need to solve these things. And we don't recognize how deep and profound these problems are in the same way that all of the other forms of prejudice, which, as you so bravely said before, are now suddenly being licensed by the results of the recent election. The cost of those will not only be in all of the other things we see, but I think also in the deaths of many children, the ones who are bullied, some of the ones who are bullying, who themselves feel lost and insecure by people who feel like there aren't any boundaries or any parameters. And that idea, of course, is often absorbed through social media. Now, you see, if you have kids, that they are often getting a lot from social media. My son has made a point that the only social media he uses is Discord. He gets on it, he plays games with friends. I discovered later that it is actually a route to extensive child exploitation. And when I said that to him, he said, not so far. So that seems to be it. But he has all of these people and he has lots of friends in real life, but he also has the people he talks to online, and they often have very different perspectives and are less homogenous than the people he meets at his school in liberal New York. And he'll come back and say, I couldn't believe this guy said such, and we'll have a family conversation about it. And they're integrated into his consciousness. And it would be a loss to remove all of that from his experience. I also think we have to look at the idea when we get away from the single cause of layers. And that's a word that came to me when I was interviewing a family in Utah whose son had died by suicide. He had been brought up in a strict Mormon household. He was gay. He was an addict. He developed a kidney infection that could be traced back to what in Utah is considered underage sex. He became involved with an older man we met on social media who had exploited him. And then was asked to testify in the trial that sent that man, whom he at some level seemed to love, to jail. and he killed himself a little while after that. And when I sat with his parents outside Salt Lake City and talked about it, his mother said, there just are so many layers, she said, and she said, we can't address all of them. She said, but in many instances, she said, it's not that I would say this is what caused it. It's that I would say it took 26 layers to get him to the point of killing himself. And if we could eliminate one or two of them, maybe he would still be here. Maybe we would have Stockton Dewson among us. And she said, what I've really learned as a parent is not to be one of those layers. And so the question then is, how do you eliminate those layers, and what is the kind of research that's involved, and how do you get that research conducted? Matt Nock, who won a MacArthur and who's really led a lot of the suicide research in this country, and who's at Harvard, talked about how incredibly difficult it is to get IRB approval for studies he wants to do, because they keep saying to him, but some people might die. And he said, yes, he said, but you are funding oncology studies in which some people might die. Suicide, as was pointed out earlier, is the second leading cause of death among young people, but we avoid studying it. It has a tiny fraction of the funding that's available for all kinds of other illnesses. We avoid studying it because we find it so frightening. And I want to look a little bit about where that fear comes from, and what it feels like. So as I talk to these various families about their children's use of social media, was struck by how little they knew, and of course, in turn, by how little I know. I mean, my son says, I'm only on Discord. He says, I'm going to go upstairs and do my history homework. It would be handy if they were all separate machines. There was one that you could do homework on. There was one that you could do social media on. There was one where you could look up things you needed to know, but they're not. They're all one machine. And unless I sort of hover over him, which now that he's 15, I think would not be very welcome, there's no way really for me to know. And so a lot of the families I talked to didn't know what their children were doing. And yet, when you read the press coverage, the sort of anger, how could they not know? They must have, how could they not? There's a great deal of accusation, which is, of course, the defense of people who don't want to really reckon with the fact that they don't know what their own children or their friends' children, whoever it may be, are doing, and that they don't really have very much control over it. And there has been a tendency in some states, including Utah, which is part of why I went there, to say what we need to do is give parents more control. But parents are ordinarily not as quick to pick up on new technology as younger people are. And younger people are quite good at finding ways to elude the attention of their parents. So, so I will tell you, for example, about C.J. Dawley. His parents, his father is works in construction. He's a plumber. His parents are delightful people. They live in southern Wisconsin. And CJ was the sort of bright, shining star. Neither of his parents had been to college. CJ got the highest score on state tests that had ever been recorded at his school. He loved taking things apart and putting them together. His parents came home one day to find that he had taken their new computer apart. It was in 1,000 pieces on the floor. The next day, he had put it back together and it worked just fine. He was, I think, 13 when that happened. He had been offered a full scholarship to Duke. He looked like he was rather good looking, though he thought he was too skinny, but he certainly looks pleasant looking and had lots of sort of attention from the young women he was pursuing. And then he said to one of the people he had met online, and again, someone was talking earlier about the fact that people tend to talk to peers often before they talk to anyone else. He said, every time I think of going to college and the future, I just want to kill myself. And the girl he was talking to, with whom he'd had some degree of romance, said, you need to talk to someone. And he said, I'm talking to you. But she was also 15 and in Wisconsin and didn't know, I mean, not that people in Wisconsin wouldn't know, but my husband is from Wisconsin. But just that she was not someone who was educated in the field of mental health particularly, and she didn't really know what to say or what to do. And I found in listening to these stories, because I've heard so many of them, I've become almost inured to the basic information. I had a child who died and I'm grief-stricken. And yet every time I talk to people, details come up that suddenly bring it to life. So the family was taking down Christmas ornaments. CJ was in bed. His father went and said, come on, you have to help with the Christmas ornament. He said he was too tired. His family didn't know at that point that because he was spending so much time on social media, he was getting only 3 hours of sleep a night, which is enough to make anyone, but especially adolescents who require a lot of sleep, completely insane. And so he went back in his room and they were all sort of slightly annoyed. And his mother had made lasagna, which was his favorite dish. And she said to me, normally I would take his to him when he's hiding in his room. But this time I thought, well, he was just out with us. He'll come out again soon. And I didn't bring him a plate of lasagna. And that hurt so bad that if I would have brought him a plate of lasagna, he would have talked to me. I haven't made homemade lasagna since. I can't. I know he loved lasagna, so I knew he would have wanted it, but I wasn't thinking, and I let him down big time. And I thought, well, it wasn't the lasagna that was really the issue, but people hold on to this idea always of sort of, I could have saved my child, because that is the social narrative that you always hear, oh, if you'd only done such and such, and they attach it to whatever it may be. When they went into his room a little bit later on, he had shot himself through the head and dropped his gun, but his phone was still clutched in his hand, and it was dripping blood because he had posted his suicide as he was doing it. And on the back of his acceptance letter from Northwestern, he had written, I don't want you to think that this is all your fault. It's not. I'm all fucked up. You showed me love and family. I wish I didn't have to do this to you guys. I love you all more than the world. It's just hard to be a person now. And I wish that I believed in God. If God does exist, he will have to beg for my forgiveness. There's a lot you don't know about me. What goes on inside my head scares me. I try to be a good person. It's just as if I'm running in a dark tunnel, running after the light so I can be happy, but my legs are tired. And what's a man to do when the light goes out? Tell my friends thank you for the friendship and support, and that I love them with all my being. And his mother, when they found out how little he had been sleeping, in addition to all else, said that if she had known, she would have taken his phone away. But she said, but when Chris, the father, once took the phone, oh my God, CJ was ready to run away from home. I thought we might never see him again. He needed that phone. And his father said, it was his life. It would be like saying, hey, your punishment is they were going to keep you locked up in the attic for the next week. That's how isolated kids feel when they don't have that phone. And then he said, we're hoping the parents will get together and say, we're going to treat it like drugs, like alcohol, like a sharp knife. You're not going to let your kid run around with a sharp knife? Then don't let your kid get onto these sites until they're 18. I thought I was a good and responsible father. I checked around the house and locked the doors every night, making everything nice and safe. But I didn't understand that the lion was already inside the house. So the person who has been one of the leaders in the movement to address these questions is a lawyer in the West Coast named Matthew Bergman. And he is very dramatic, and he has not really been the legal thinker, but he has been the activist who has stirred people up. And he sort of doesn't let you alone if you're not as upset as he is. I remember the first time I interviewed him, I was expressing mild skepticism, and he said, well, then you talk to a mom who describes cleaning her son's brain out of her hair. The link is irrefutable. And I then sat down and started reading some of the lawsuits that have been brought. And over and over and over again, they're full of these terrible, terrible stories. Someone who said, how do you mend a broken heart? He asked online. And he was shown suicide videos telling him to blow his head off, which is what he did. You can't walk away from the bully, Matt Bergman said to me. It's like you're running up into his fist. And here are a few other excerpts from some of these lawsuits. Sienne's honor roll status and dreams for her future became a distant memory. Her eating disorder resulted in significant loss of muscle and parts of her brain. Over the last 4 years, plaintiffs have survived 10 hospitalizations, including 1 residential stay and 2 active suicide attempts, because of Instagram's inherently harmful and dangerous social media project. Sienne developed a brain condition known as prolactinoma. Instagram, this is another one, specifically targeted VW with messaging and imagery that promoted extreme weight loss, glamorized harmful relationships to food, dieting, and exercise, and drastically undermined VW's self-image and self-worth. VW's physician diagnosed her with bulimia, irregular menstruation, tachycardia, generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, suicidal ideation, and non-suicidal self-harm, all before her 17th birthday, and all because of Instagram's design. And I'll just say one of the things that is striking if you talk to some of these kids is that they will say, look at these lives. These lives look so amazing. My life is nothing like that. And you say, well, your life isn't like that, but neither is theirs. And what you're posting on Instagram makes it look as though your life is like that. The same way and they know that they're putting forward a false image of themselves, but they cannot process the idea that other people are doing the same thing. Carson was a preteen when he began using social media as a means to communicate and connect. As a proximate result of his compulsion to interact with defendants' platforms, and specifically due to recommendations and content defendants selected and showed him, Carson developed depression and anxiety, which would ultimately lead to his death by suicide at age 14. SU provided her Discord user information to Charlie's, who exploited and abused SU for months. He encouraged her to drink and take prescription drugs and manipulated her, and then introduced her to several of his friends who also manipulated, exploited, and abused SU, who was 10 and 11 at the time. SU attempted suicide in late July 2020 and killed herself in August. I can go on and on. I actually have quite a lot of them here. I won't go on and on, but I think this idea of the dangers of social media, which sounded a little abstract, as it appropriately should in presentations by people who are studying it, for those of us who are journalists and have gone out into that world, the reality of it can be utterly overpowering. As one mother said to me, Zuckerberg's motto is to move fast and break things. As I have shown, he and his companions succeeded in breaking my child and my child's childhood. So I went down to Louisiana, where I met with some people called Darla and Ryan Gill, who lived in a northern part of Louisiana. It was a 6-hour drive from New Orleans. Their daughter, Emma Claire, appeared to be beautiful and successful and popular in all kinds of ways within their community. Her father woke up one morning and got Emma Claire up on a Sunday at 5:30 in the morning and said, can you feed the pigs because I have to help one of the neighbors? And they were all getting ready to go to church a couple of hours later, and Emma Claire didn't come to the car. And Ryan said, oh, she was up feeding the pigs. And so Darla, the mother, went up and she said, as soon as I saw her legs sticking out from a feed bag, I knew that something had happened. She had shot herself in the head, and she had been caught trying to sneak out of the house the night before, and her family had taken away her phone. And her mother's hypothesis was that she had written her suicide note in that period when she didn't have the phone. And she had two younger siblings, and the parents described trying to go on parenting those younger siblings. And Darla said to me, I just kind of stopped parenting my children. Rylan had a computer and said something about taking her computer because of something she'd done. And Ryan reminded me, we took Emma Claire's phone and she killed herself. And Ryan took me up to the place in that barn where Emma Claire had been feeding the pigs and where they'd put up a little white plastic cross in the corner on the rough wood. And he said to me, and I remember thinking it was especially shocking in this sort of, he was in a very conservative community, deeply involved in his church and so on and so forth. And he said to me, I said to him, do you think there could have been an assault of any kind? The time she had snuck out of the house had apparently been, they think, to meet a boy whom they had eventually tracked down. And I said, do you think anything could have happened? And he said, well, they did an autopsy and they did to make sure and to see. And he said, no, there was no evidence of that. And then he said to me, but I'll tell you the truth. He said, if I found out that someone had raped my daughter, I would actually be really relieved because then I would understand what happened. He said, the way it is, I just don't understand it. And that is so hard to live with. And I think one of the things that is overwhelming to these families is that sense of bewilderment, which is often at least as oppressive as any sense of loss related to losing a child. Now, the last one of these stories that I'll recount is of Tony and Brandy Roberts, who are also in Louisiana. Brandy is a school teacher. Tony had been a manager at a Lowe's and then retired. They have spoken out and have attracted a certain amount of attention because there are fewer Black families who have spoken out about these problems. Their daughter was their total delight. She was very much spoiled, and they showed me a lot of home videos in which England is laughing and smiling, and they have a pillow on their sofa, which was given to them by one of her friends who put a recording of England laughing in it. And if you lean on it, the room fills up with these peals of laughter. But online, England had been posting, physically, I'm here, but mentally, I'm very far away. One day, I'm going to leave this world and never come back. You're going to cry when you see a picture of me. You ain't going to hear my laugh or my irritating voice again. So you need to appreciate me before I'm gone, because I'm dying every day. And then last, I show people what they want to see. But behind the social media life, nobody knows the real me and how much I struggle to make sure everyone's good, even though I'm not. And her father showed me one of the Instagram videos that had been sent to her, which was a young Black woman who looked a little bit like her, who was screaming at the top of her lungs into the camera, stop this madness. What do you want from me? What do you want? Please, please, stop this madness. What do you want from me? What do you want? Please. And then hangs herself with an electrical cord from her door hinge. And England had an evening that seemed to be a nice evening with her family, and then went up to her room. And that's what she did. She hanged herself exactly as the woman in that video had. And her father described going up into her room just to check on her. And because he had opened the door, she was behind it, and he didn't see her anywhere. And he said to me what it was like when he turned around, and he spotted it. And they've become very outspoken activists. And they've been deeply motivated in part by faith, which has given them the sense that they have a job to do. and that part of their job involves forgiveness. But Tony said to me, children don't come with instructions. I didn't either. But those algorithms gave them instructions that the companies failed to disclose to the world. I tell Brandy all the time, how in the hell could this happen? How could man develop such a thing as an algorithm that trumps her parents' love? How could a machine mean more to her than us? And I had said to him several times in the course of the conversation, what effect do you think race had in your experience of this? And initially, Brandy in particular kept saying, well, we just want to show this happens to everyone. But it was Louisiana, and it was a tough part of Louisiana, and that seemed unlikely to me. And finally, she said, if you look at the news, she said, you will see that the deaths of Black children get much less coverage than the deaths of white children. And if we talk a lot about being targets because we were Black, she said, we'll disappear right out of the news and we won't be able to do the work that we're here to do. And then her father said to me, Mark Zuckerberg put the lifetime value of a teenager, which he did in the Facebook papers when he talked about what the profit was that could come from hooking a teenager. He put the lifetime value of a teenager at $270. The price of a slave in 1760 was $260. He's building this compound over in Hawaii. He's raising beef cattle on macadamia nuts and beer to have the best flavored beef in the world. That's a plantation. He's just the new modern day slave owner. He said, my ancestors had their backs broken so that rich white men could live like that. And he's living that way on the broken body of my daughter. For people like us, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed at all. He's just the new massa. So after having these experiences, I went to the congressional hearings in January, in which the heads of the 5 major social media companies appeared before the Senate Judiciary hearing. And I went with a lot of the parents whose stories you've just heard and some others I had spoken to, because they all thought, having lobbied and lobbied, that there might be change. And those 5 people, I was sitting initially with the parents. The intensity of emotion with that group of parents was almost beyond description. And everyone had brought, like people did in Chile during the protests against Pinochet, large photographs on board of their children, usually of their children smiling. And then the 5 social media executives entered the room, and all of the parents held up those pictures. Now, I know that the social media executives had been told by lawyers, oh, you can't sort of say that this was your fault in front of... But to walk into that room was such an emotionally charged experience. And none of them showed any emotion at all, except that when Josh Hawley was posing for the CNN camera, he told Mark Zuckerberg to apologize, and Zuckerberg turned around with a very irritated expression. And his apology was, no one should have to go through what you all have been through. So there was intense emotion, and then there was no emotion, really no emotion. And then in the front were all of these people. There were a few of those senators who were deeply committed, but there were a lot of them who knew that this was a subject that now plays very well to the electorate. And so I thought, oh, it's fake emotion in the front, and then it's no emotion in the middle, and it's unbelievable, overpowering emotion in the back. And the people I was sitting with got angrier and angrier. And one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg kept saying was, now we have algorithms, and 99% of the time, we have these, 99, and he kept saying 99% of the time. Well, in the first place, in anything as large as Facebook, 99% of the time is missing a lot. But even so, one of them turned to me, one of the mothers, and said, if you found out that McDonald's hamburgers, 99% of them were not made with dog poop, how often would you take your children there? And that was the feeling in the room. And Brandy, who I was just talking about, said, we're accomplishing nothing here. And it was the 17th congressional hearing. There have been no laws passed that have anything to do with bringing about these regulations. And I'm going to end by saying that I had a personal introduction to a woman. I said I wouldn't use her name. You'll probably guess who I'm talking about, who was one of the leaders of the social media world and the CEO of one of the largest social media companies. And she and I talked about this whole matter and the whole question of what was going on. She had some very revealing things to say. She did ask me not to use her name, so I haven't. But when we were finishing the conversation, we had been exchanging messages for several weeks. As we were finishing the conversation, she said, by the way, she said, do you have a deadline? And I said, well, I'm working on it. It's taking a while. I hope it. She said, you better get that article out fast. She said, because the damage artificial intelligence is going to be doing to children is so vast that no one's going to be interested in what you're writing about if you wait more than a few more months. So on that cheerful note, I will draw this to a close. But what does one do? It would be Talibanish to say to your children, you can't ever look at a computer, and they couldn't do their schoolwork and they couldn't live in the world. How much you can do as parents, you can do some stuff. You can try to follow it. I will end actually, so there's a lighter note. When my children first got access to the internet, they did not have phones, but they had computers. I got a monitoring program installed so that I could find out if they were doing anything wrong. And for about 6 weeks, they seemed to be fine. At the end of 6 weeks, I received a notice that said that my daughter, who was then 12, was ordering drug paraphernalia online, and my son, who was 10, was corresponding with a pederast. So as you can imagine, I was horrified. And I then checked to see what had happened. My daughter had ordered 3 crochet needles from Amazon, not drug paraphernalia where I've seen. And the email that my son had received said, I want you in bed in 10 minutes, you're going to be in big trouble. And it was from me. Thank you all. I'm glad to take some questions. Yes. Anyone? Yes.
Thank you. Very moving. Thank you. It was very moving. All the evidence we have looked at today through all these presentations and all the stories, they're from mostly the US or the global north. And you talked about monitoring, you talked about more restraint imposed by parents. And that reminds me of my cultural background, coming from the global south. Is there any evidence or stories from the global south that point to or hint at any of these being effective in helping adolescents cope better or be less vulnerable? Is there anything we can look to the global south for?
Well, there are 2 matters, I think, where the global south is relevant. And it's a thing that I will ultimately address when I am writing a book, but it's hard to squeeze everything into a talk. The first thing is that all of these companies in the West feel, or the global North, or whatever, it's parts of the global North at least, feel that the issue of liability is pending and that they need to make a lot of money quickly. And 99% is not great, but they are picking up 99%, or at least they're picking up 90% and calling it 99% as certain kinds of content violations. Much of what is being done in the global south is in languages that are not spoken by the monitors who are supposed to be overseeing these matters. Facebook, for example, 87% of its monitoring staff speaks English. and works primarily in English, leaving 13% for the rest of the world, most of which is in Europe. So there's just a lack of monitoring. And so the speed with which that horrific content spreads, though it's bad here, is actually even worse in the global South. There is somewhat less access to some of this material, but not that much less access. It's penetrated into so many contexts and into so many places. I think that the question in looking in a larger sense at issues in the global South, and I mean, these generalizations are pernicious, and I want to be very careful of them. But there was a study some years ago that showed that outcomes are often better for schizophrenia in India than they are in the United States. And when there was more study of that, people living in supportive and extended family structures often have supports that can be very difficult for people to have here. And I mean, again, I feel so cautious at these generalizations. I feel they can sound patronizing, which is not at all my intent. I think there are still, in many instances, in some places, there are structures that are helpful to people, and that the relationship between children and their peers is more tempered by the relationship with adults than it often is in these parts around here. But again, it varies, and certainly there are other places in the global South which are, where the problem of suicide is even higher than it is here, and the problem of youth suicide. So I mean, this is wrong with generalizing. The global South is a large area. There's a lot to be learned from it. There are some remarkable things, but and there is this problem of not monitoring. I mean, in Ethiopia, where parts of the civil war that has been taking place there, in which so many people have died, and to which the Western press has paid so little attention, a lot of it came through posts on Facebook that were in languages that nobody actually at Facebook could speak. Facebook and a couple of other sites, but primarily Facebook in that particular instance. So it's mixed, and it varies from country to country, and from even within countries from one place to another. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for an interesting and challenging talk. I am interested in sort of what you think about implications of modifying Section 230, which, as you know, came about with regarding in an age when ISPs were being sued for content which was being, I think, posted using those internet service providers, and the extent to which I mean, obviously there's a something like repealing that section of the Communications Decency Act. There's replacing it with something else. But one of the things that I always sort of grapple with in this is that anyone who has ever complained, as some parts of the political spectrum have, on censorship on social media, have seen nothing like what would happen if that were to be repealed. At which point, if you have platforms are liable, can be liable for all of the content, then in their current form, I think they would cease to exist. And of course, we can have a conversation about whether or not that's a desirable thing, or whether it would exist in some other form. But any sort of attempt to be part of an online community, even positive online community, some of which people have talked about here today, and sort of all of that would also, I think, be under similar threat in its current form. And so that this is not me standing up and arguing on behalf of big tech, but it's that it's in the same way that free speech protects both speech which supports sort of minority voices and also can oppress it. And there's only one First Amendment, that there's only one Section 230. And so I grapple with sort of what the knock-on effects of doing that are, not just in domains like this, where I think you've made very eloquently and with much sort of rhetorical force an argument for why change is needed, but I don't know how to do that without simultaneously having these other effects. And surely this is a thing you've thought about, and I would be interested to hear that.
Well, I should begin by saying that I'm not a lawyer or a legislator, and drafting legislation is not my specialty. I was for many years president of a free speech organization, and have worked a lot on free speech issues in general. Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, as most of you probably know, shouting fire in a crowded theater is not protected speech. And I think the question of how you work out where something crosses over and how different governmental bodies would do that is complicated. But Britain has passed an act which the Online Safety Act that we came through Bevan Kidron in the House of Lords originally, but has now become law in England, that I think proposes, some restraints that insist that there be, at this congressional hearing, they all kept saying, but we don't allow users who are under the age of 13. All you have to do is tick a box saying you're 13 and you can be a user under the age of 13. If they're going to say that, then age verification, which is complicated but not impossible, should be part of the process, and they should actually be true to it. But I think the point where this conversation really shifted was with the emergence first in the Australian, where there were, they revealed some Facebook stuff that was all about targeting users who fit a variety of what we would think of as insulting adjectives, and how you could sort of exploit children who were, losery, or who I can't remember what they were. I have them written down somewhere. But then with the Facebook papers that Frances Haugen put forward, and then the ones that Arturo Bejar, I think somebody referred to them earlier, put forward, which really show that the companies have deliberately set out to create and to push forward content that they know is harmful to people. And they do it without warning people. So I think you could say that if you have found that people are dying because of this particular content, then that would be a reason to consider not putting forward that content, or at the very least, to say and to have a public campaign so that parents are aware of it as well. This is the content that actually seems to cause some people to kill themselves, and probably you don't want your child to look at it, but, like with alcohol and cigarettes and things, it's up to you. I mean, we have lots of things that we don't allow 8-year-olds to drive cars. We don't allow them to do things. Judith Edersheim, who's a scholar at Harvard, whose sister I went to college with here, she said the way that it's set up right now, she said it's as if you took children and you put them in a 24-hour casino and served chocolate-flavored bourbon. She said it's all done deliberately to seduce children and to seduce them in ways that are known to be harmful to them. So the content being available and the content being sort of pushed in the ways that it is are two questions, but also how do you moderate the content? I mean, the content that I read to you about that 10-year-old who had the men who wanted to her to send them pictures of herself and who then killed herself. 10-year-olds, I think that there is a point at which you can say, okay, people under a certain age should be protected from certain kinds of material. And I can sort of go on and on about this, but it's irrelevant to this meeting. But I think that if there were clearer definitions of what constitutes harm, that we might have less polarization in our political system and in the country altogether. But we're not going to get into the question of whether adult social media needs to be regulated. We're talking about children, and we don't need to ban books for children, I don't think, in general. And I don't think we need to get them off all of it, but I think we need to explain what's at stake, and also to make it more possible to find out what they're doing, because the parents cannot find out what their children. I don't know what my children are looking at. I only know what they tell me. But the companies actually have incredibly detailed record. I mean, the one actually sort of delightful moment of that hearing was when Senator Kennedy, who is not in general someone I particularly admire, but he crossed his arms and he said, Mr. Zuckerberg, I've heard a lot of technical vocabulary today. He said, but do you know the meaning of the words yada, yada, yada? And Mark Zuckerberg looked at him totally blankly and said, I don't think I know that one. He said, well, I've heard a lot of yada, yada, yada here today. He said, and I just want to see, am I right in understanding your business? Well, you get people to give you all their private information starting when they're little children, so you can target advertising, you know everything about them, you can make an infinite amount of money, and in exchange, when they're older, they can find out what their friends from high school had for dinner on Tuesday. He said, is that the model? And Mark Zuckerberg said, well, no, it's more, and everyone just burst into laughter because there was the sense that the exchange of information that people often don't understand they're relinquishing and what they're getting in return for it is not clear. And if it were clear, you could make the decision, well, I'll give up all my information because I really want to know these particular things I can find out. It's the sense that it's being purloined that I think is also part of the problem, especially for children who don't really understand the consequences in many instances of giving up that information.
Thank you so much. You've given us such a gift. We're so grateful.
Thanks you.